The Queensland branch of the AIG welcome you to the May AIG-ALS technical meeting. Tonight's talk is from Holly Bridgwater of Unearthed Solutions, who poses the question, can tapping into a global network accelerate discovery of mineral deposits? Holly is an exploration geologist with over 10 years experience in the mining industry. She currently is the industry lead for Crowdsourcing at Unearthed, an open innovation platform. Holly's work with leaders in the resource sector on how to partner with external innovators brings teams together to challenge themselves and create innovative solutions, empowers people in the sector, and works with a huge community of data scientists, developers, startups, and innovators. Holly has played a leading role in delivering Australia's two largest open data sourcing competitions, AusMinerals Explorer Challenge and ExploreSA the Gawler Challenge, which is currently operating. Holly believes that leveraging open data and crowdsourcing initiatives can transform mineral exploration and increase discovery rates of critical metals. It's now time to welcome Holly Bridgwater. Thanks very much.
As I said, we're going to really be focused on the concept of how we apply this to mineral exploration and specifically exploration targeting. So for the majority of this talk, I'm actually going to do a deep dive into how this can potentially work in an exploration targeting sense to actually improve our targeting process and give us better predictions, and run through how that will work, why, how we can apply it, and how do we actually make this approach accessible to everybody. And then to kind of wrap up the talk, going to focus on a couple of more discrete examples where we're actually using the crowd in a more discrete way to run a couple of kind of data science approaches to automate a few exploration processes. So hopefully you'll find those interesting as well. So, you know, there's a number of companies out there that have been looking to this concept of crowdsourcing to help with their exploration targeting. We saw Rob McEwen down there in the right-hand corner from Goldcorp do the first one of these challenges back in the year 2000 to help identify some new gold targets around their projects in Canada. Integra Goldcorp kind of followed suit in 2015, followed by Oz in 2019, and the South Australian government running ExploreSA, which is currently live this year. So the rationale behind the majority of these approaches is really that if we put our data out there to a broad network of people, we can actually get lots of different opinions back and lots of different interpretations of that data, with the ultimate aim of improving how we target. And there's lots of additional benefits to these approaches, particularly found through the work we're doing with AusMinerals, that the exposure to the geological team there of lots of new workflows, particularly in the machine learning data science space, was really interesting for them to actually update and reflect on their own overall exploration workflows. But today I'm going to really focus on the actual application of that around the generating targets themselves. So the talk's really going to focus on why we use this and how we use this, particularly just to generate targets and how to assess those. So to kind of set the scene a little bit, I know we kind of all know this, but it's kind of, I think it's worth having this concept in our mind as we go through this, that fundamentally in mineral exploration, we deal with data-driven predictions all the time because we can't detect mineral deposits directly in general. So, you know, we have a lot of our work is focused on how do we predict where deposits are, what type of predictions do we use, but often we find that we, you know, can't necessarily explain much about the accuracy of our predictions and the details of how we generate them. So the next few slides is kind of exploring a little bit around fundamentals of how we predict in different scenarios. And I hope you'll bear with me as I kind of tell this story and then bring it back to the exploration setting. So it's kind of an interesting question to say, why would actually more opinions mean better predictions? Like, why is it actually better to have more than just one expert opinion? You've probably at some point in time come across this phrase of, you know, particularly in stock market predictions, predicting the markets, this may as well just have a monkey throwing darts at a dartboard. And although we kind of use that phrase to kind of make joke at how bad we are at predicting, there's actually quite a lot of studies that have gone into showing how good experts actually are at predicting things. And interestingly, a majority of these studies, and that's across the stock market, political events, a number of different disciplines, individual experts nearly always perform worse than random guessing, definitely worse than average and worse than monkeys throwing darts at a dartboard. But what a lot of these studies, the aspect of these that you don't hear about is that in nearly all of these cases, when you take those individual predictions that experts make, which are poor, combine them all together and then take an average, the average prediction is actually way better than random guessing and much, much more accurate than any one individual prediction. So why this is interesting is really, can we apply this to mineral exploration? And some of the theory behind why this happens, which is pretty relevant to us as well, is that individual experts are by their nature incredibly biased because they have to be. They're experts in a really specific thing. And what this means that they know their domain very, very well, but it can result in them not being able to get all the information they need to make a good prediction. And that's why when we combine a lot of experts together in a group, overall the prediction becomes significantly better. So that's a little bit of a concept that we're using here to talk about how we apply that to mineral exploration. Could, if we combine lots of predictions from different experts, we actually get better at predicting. Before I go into talking through specific use cases in geology and exploration, I wanted to give another kind of real world physical example. So this is around hurricane tracking, and I really like this example because I think there's a lot of really great analogies to mineral systems and geoscience. So in this case, just like geology, with cyclones, meteorologists really understand very well how they form, and they know and they can predict roughly where they're going to occur and where at what time of the year. But what they can't do is definitively predict exactly what those hurricanes are going to do or the paths they're going to track because of the chaotic nature of the atmosphere. It's very similar to what we see in mineral systems. We understand them, we can predict quite well regions that will be prospective for mineral systems, but pinpointing where they are is very hard. So what meteorologists do to account for this is they actually take that same approach of these multiple models or multiple experts and combine the average. So they, on the image on the left here, you can see all of those red lines are the lines of individual models and the predictions they make of where the hurricane is going to track. And the green line is the average of all of those predictions, and the white line is the actual path that the hurricane took. So you can see that this is another kind of approach where this concept of many models combined and averaged into one is really relevant in a physical real world example. So now I'm going to take you through a couple of case studies of how we're actually applying this to mineral exploration. So how do we take that concept of combining lots of different predictions into one? The first example I'm going to talk you through is a data science one. It's using machine learning. And I think this is just useful context to actually run through how the process might work. This is an example from the Oz Minerals Explorer Challenge. And one of the things we did in the Explorer Challenge was run a separate data science stream. And the purpose of this was to help data scientists get familiar with exploration data and help them get feedback. Now, many of us know feedback is always a challenge in geoscience because we can't test our models in real life very easily. So what we did to make that a bit easier for data scientists is we actually took some Australia-wide data. We divided this up into some discrete 20 by 20 kilometer squares because dealing with the whole data set across the whole country was too big. Some of these squares contain known mineral deposits and some did not. And we asked data scientists to predict if there was a mineral deposit in the square, what commodity was, and exactly where that mineral deposit occurred within that space. The reason this was helpful was what we were able to do is subset out part of that data set and use that to provide feedback on the model's performance. So when the data scientists submitted their machine learning model, we could run that on the hidden data set and actually give them some feedback of how effective their model was at predicting. So they're actually able to assess it for them. And then they could kind of get feedback on how well the different techniques that they were thinking of using applied in this particular case. And these are some of the results. So what you can see here on the graph on the left is a plot of all of the models, or all of the individual models that got put forward. And each of those was scored based on, are they looking, or did they predict the right commodity? And how close they were in predicting the location of the deposit. So what I'm kind of talking you through this example is actually showing ways where in some cases you can actually score and you can actually assess each of the individual models that you might want to compare and contrast. So this competition ran for 6 weeks, and a global community of hundreds of machine learning experts took part and put forward 241 models. But a really important part of this process was, how do we know which of these models are actually better than random guessing? So if we go back to the monkeys throwing darts at a dartboard, of all of these models that got submitted, of all of those 241 models, which of them are actually any good? And that's an important question to ask, but it's actually not as simple as it sounds. How do we know, how well someone would do if they were completely randomly guessing? So we had to actually create a number of models that represented a random guess. For example, one of them was what happens if you predict a gold deposit to be in the center of every single one of those stamps of data, and if you did, you would plot up here. So through a number of those kind of random guess models, what we were able to do was actually numerically categorize this group of models in the top quadrant here, shaded by orange, which were better than random guessing. So that's really important, because what we're actually able to do through this process was be able to say what's better than random guessing. Now that's not necessarily good, but better than random guessing, and what's not. And we were quite surprised at the number of models that actually sat in this category, because this is a very difficult problem and we expected people to do quite poorly, considering how difficult it was. So let's have a look at this data in a slightly different way, to think of how do we actually practically use this. Okay, now we've kind of got to the point where we've subsetted those models. We've said which ones are better than guessing. So let's take a look at them plotted on a map. So this image that you have here on the left is a plot across Australia of just those models that were better than random guessing. And it's showing where they have predicted a deposit in a location that has no known deposit. So of the data set that we gave them, about half the stamps of data had known deposits and half did not. So what's really interesting here is they're actually coming up with predictions in areas which there are no known deposits. And the point I kind of want to make on this one is, now you can see we've got up to 300 of predictions, individual predictions in just one of these circles. If I was to ask you, if you had to pick one of these areas to go and look at in more detail, which one would you pick? I'm pretty sure that most of you would go for one of these darker ones here, which represents somewhat around 300 individual predictions just in that one area. And this is where we're getting to that concept of that many models approach and that consensus, is that we naturally, when we see many predictions in the same place, have a preference that we think that that one is more likely to be reasonable. We have more confidence in some of these darker circles there. So we were able to do that across the whole of Australia. As I said, this was really about onboarding data scientists, but it had some really interesting outcomes that we can start to see generating a new data set with new information around those targets. But let's have a look at this on a slightly different scale. So this is actually the results of the overall Explorer Challenge consensus piece. So what we've done here is combined all of the targets that people put forward into a similar kind of map. So obviously colors are a bit different here, but you can see those hotspots really clearly. Actually, that purple area underneath is around Prominent Hill. But you can see there's some really clear hotspots coming out for this as well. So you can use that same approach. Obviously, we've got a very big scale of the whole of Australia, but we can still apply it here. The interesting thing about this, and I'll get into some of the questions around how we do this next, is that this wasn't just about data science. We combined models from all different approaches. Could be structural analysis or geophysical analysis or a machine learning model. We've combined the outputs from all of those different styles into this one model. But it's not so easy as that. So, at Unearthed, we really like, I think that this concept of consensus is a really interesting one to continue to test. But there are a lot of considerations that go into how you build that. And I'm going to go through a number of them here. So the first one is, how do you know the targets used in the model are good? So when we had this data science machine learning example, I could show you very clearly in a quantitative way how we determined which models are allowed to go into that final consensus based on their performance. But when we come to this example, we're allowing lots of different approaches to come in. You can use it, as I said, structural analysis or some kind of geophysical analysis. So we're not able to do that. So for the Explorer Challenge, what we actually did to create this map is we had to use a panel of expert judges. A panel of experts selected which experts could get into the expert consensus model, if you like. And we had to do that because we didn't have a way of doing that quantitatively. So that's quite interesting because we are obviously having to introduce back some amount of bias. But the idea really is that we are trying to make sure that only expert and valid approaches get into this consensus model. So that's quite important. So the data, just to be clear that you're looking at here, is only the targets that were deemed to be of expert quality by the judges for that competition. So you're not looking at all the raw data. In some cases, you may say that if you have enough data points, you may not actually need to worry about which ones are the quality of them. But we think probably at this stage that's important. And that kind of leads on to a little bit of the next question, which is, how many predictions do you need for this to be statistically relevant? If we look at this example again, from the machine learning point of view, partly because you are using machine learning approach, you're getting a lot more predictions. So of course, I feel pretty confident when I see 300 individual predictions. I'm feeling pretty confident. For the main Explorer Challenge, we had a lot less, 400 in total. So some of those hotspots you see there may only represent 10 to 15 actual targets. So we don't know exactly how many will be statistically relevant because we can't actually test the amount that are correct. But it's interesting to think of how many would you actually need to have confidence in a consensus target. And then also there's a bit of a consideration around how you might apply weight to those targets. Any of you on the call who are used to doing kind of target generation are probably very familiar with weighting certain different factors. But that's also a challenge when you try and create these consensus models. For example, if I'm using machine learning, I might have a number of ways of weighting those models based on their output. But how am I to weight a structural interpretation versus a geophysical interpretation or a combined interpretation? It's not so easy to then start applying weights to those. And then we have some other smaller issues, which are a bit further down on the list there, of how you might combine different types of predictions. Some people obviously approach this problem with prospectivity mapping. Some might approach with machine learning, which might output a polygon and things like that. And how do you adjust at scale? We saw some examples here of the whole of Australia and then down to a fairly kind of local project scale. But how you actually combine the targets to say what is your actual consensus and how close they have to be is another interesting challenge. So we think that this approach is really interesting and that the concept works really well, but there's certainly some of these considerations that we need to take into account, or anyone should take into account when trying to look at this approach. And of course, again, this is nothing new for us, but what's always a challenge when you come to exploration targeting is that it's very, very difficult for us to test things accurately. You know, most of the time we will never know if our predictions are true or false. And even drilling, it's so easy to miss something that this is definitely obviously not a foolproof method. So it does make it really difficult to prove if a method like this consensus approach actually works. You have to try it a number of times and go through a number of iterations to actually demonstrate that. I think that's important to bear that in mind. You know, I think we had some results from the Oz Minerals Explorer Challenge, some really early stage ones with where Oz drilled their first 5 holes into some of those targets, and those 5 holes didn't intersect any significant mineralization, and they announced that publicly. So I received quite a lot of comments say, oh, you know, that must be such a bummer, it clearly doesn't work. But I think that is, you know, fundamentally against how we approach geology, and that we do know that we have to try things a few times, and it is very difficult to definitively test these things because of their nature. One other thing I'll say quickly on this is an important thing to bear in mind is that when you think about how you combine this to what your internal team might do, one of the other pieces of feedback I got was, oh, it seems like a lot of these targets are targets that have already been predicted by the geologists in-house. I was like, absolutely, that is exactly what you would hope. So you'd hope that that actually forms part of your consensus model. And the idea here is that you've got lots of independent, completely different approaches, including those of your internal geologists, coming together. So when you get multiple predictions in the same place stack on top, that's exactly what you want to see. Okay, so now I'm going to touch on that question of how do we make this approach applicable to everybody? A lot of people see some of these competitions are fairly public, got really large prize money behind them. And I just want to kind of say as a caveat, certainly don't want people to think that that prize money should be a barrier. Certainly don't have to have a large cash pool behind that to make this applicable for you. I think in terms of why you might actually consider doing it, it really just is around kind of a quicker method around generating a lot of targets for your team. Particularly in the junior sector, we find a lot of people, you may not have very large teams, you may not have access and capacity of people to do a lot of this work. They're usually in the field, kind of just operating your exploration program. So this can be a way that you can shortcut the exploration cycle and get more value from your dollars. And of course, one of the really good things about it is it doesn't limit you to any particular approach. You can create these consensus through multiple different approaches. You don't have to use just machine learning or just, you know, prospectivity mapping, something like that. So how do you do it? So I'll give you a quick rundown of some different points that we run through, and some of these are no small feat to get past, but I think it's interesting to first check in on, is it suitable to put to the crowd? Now, your data is going out to the public. There are obviously certain situations where you might not want that to happen. For example, if you are in a new mineral province, you found a new discovery and there's lots of vacant ground around you, it's probably not a great idea to talk about that in a public space. But for the most part, situations like with Oz Minerals, where you have a project you've been working on for a long time, you have a fair bit of data, you'd like to get more value from it. Or even if you're junior, you've got some ground, you've picked it up maybe relatively recently, and you'd like to get some quick work done on the targeting, and you'd like to do that pretty quickly. It's another couple of examples where it's suitable to put to the crowd. I think the biggest barrier to this approach, without doubt, is convincing, particularly your board, to release data to the public. Just in the sense that is generally, you know, culturally, this is quite a different approach. It's not something that anybody is used to doing. So you've got quite a barrier when you're trying to convince someone to do something completely different that they're really not comfortable with doing. It can be done, we've seen it being done, but I think for most people, this is probably the biggest barrier to doing this kind of activity. But once you get that, you're away. So the next thought there is just setting up your data so that it's securely accessible, which is important. Deciding what outcome you're actually asking for. So what are you asking people to do? Are you asking them to predict a certain deposit style? Are you asking them to generate regional targets? What do you actually want as an outcome? Then engage a global community of experts to actually do the work and combine their results into the consensus model. So what Unearthed kind of focus on is particularly these bottom four. So we host your data ourselves, and we do obviously like engage the community and combine the results on your behalf. So anyone could potentially do any of these steps, but we kind of help particularly in that point there. Okay, so done a quick 25 odd minutes on that big kind of concept of consensus, and that concept of how many models combined together can actually significantly improve how we target, and hopefully demonstrated that it is actually something that is approachable for anyone, whether you're a junior or a mid-tier or a large company. But there are barriers, particularly around getting your board on board with releasing data into the public. And yeah, happy to answer any more questions on that later on. So, we've talked about these really big kind of crowdsourcing competitions that we're doing around exploration targeting. What I'm going to run through now is a couple of distinct examples where people are solving distinct geological problems with the crowd of data scientists. So these are a lot more discrete, smaller applications, which I hope you find relevant as well. Why would you do this? A lot of the things we're seeing here are kind of the general reasons you would do data science anyway. So automate and optimize some of your processes, increase confidence of your outcomes, and get more value from your data. Really, the reason for potentially considering doing this with the crowd is if you want to kind of rapidly assess a few different models, you might not know which one is the best approach. And by doing that with the crowd, you get lots of people working on it with completely different models and approaches. So you can see what actually works best for your situation. So I'm just going to quickly run through a few different examples that different companies have done with crowdsourcing and data science. So you can see what kind of things are possible. And a lot of these things you could probably also do with other vendors as well. As I said, the main reason for going to the crowd is to do it quickly if you don't have access to skills, and also if you're not sure what's the best approach to take. So the example that I've got here is something called the ORX challenge, which was from Goldfields. This was actually back in 2015, I think. And Goldfields were interested in developing an algorithm, excuse me, that could, from photos, basically classify an image as to whether it was high grade, low grade, or waste in terms of gold. So in this instance, we had a few hundred photos for which data scientists could build their models on, and build algorithms essentially to make that decision and classify that photo to say whether it was or low grade or high grade or low grade or waste. So the resulting top algorithm ended up being around 80% accurate, which is actually pretty impressive. And it also kind of removes some of the subjective bias. So 80% accuracy was slightly more accurate than the geologist at the time, which I hate to say, but it's kind of true, I suppose. But more specifically, it's not just about being more accurate than the geologist, but more making real-time decisions enabled and reducing the need for geologists to be underground. So this is an example of something you can do in that data science space, which you can put to use pretty quickly. The next couple of examples are going to give you specifically around drill core. Now, again, we did this a few years ago. There's now some products on the market which do this. Again, I would recommend, if there are products on the market which have been specifically developed, go for those. If you want to use the crowd, it's really around, as I said, doing something if you're not sure what the best approach is. So in this example, Get to the Core for Newcrest, they're basically interested in getting an algorithm that could, from core photography, essentially identify the core within the photos and then just crop out just that core, which could then be stitched together. So Newcrest were looking to do that, to integrate that algorithm into a software package that they already had, and so ran this competition to get the best algorithm to do that, and that's now used within their business. And then the second iteration of this one was to start looking in more detail of what else you could do with core photography. So I really like this Get to the Core too, because a lot of people didn't believe it was possible. And what Newcrest wanted to do here was see if it was feasible to actually automatically detect the depth markings in these photos. So as we all know, they can be written on the core itself, on the tray, on a board, in fairly illegible handwriting, and I can take blame for some of that handwriting. But the point was, people thought, the handwriting is so bad, we're just not going to be able to do this. But actually, this competition worked really well. I think, again, it was around 80% accuracy, and people were able to automatically detect the values for the depths and depth register the markings on the photos. So what that enabled Newcrest to then do is then use that information and bring these images into that software again. So you can see there are some of these kind of specific examples that are more discrete problems, but you can still use that kind of crowdsourcing approach. And there's plenty of other options that you can apply this to as well. So I'm sure a lot of you are probably already doing something in the data science or machine learning space, but plenty of other things that you could think about. For example, I'm seeing a lot of people developing models around using geochemistry to generate near-miss models. Machine learning is a good application here because the relationships can be quite complex due to the spatial variation that we see. So it's not so easy with the current software that most geoscientists use to uncover some of these complex 3D vectoring relationships, but machine learning is great for that. You can also do things like using spectral data to automatically map your alteration, or use some of the raw drilling data of your drill rig to predict things like rock characteristics, hardness, slumble index, things like that. So you can see there's a whole wealth of potential opportunities that you could use in this approach, but ultimately it is really about automating some of the processes that we do now just to make our workflows a lot more efficient and overall a lot more data driven. So that's kind of most of the things that I have to go through today. I think some of the take homes that I'd like to kind of leave you with are that this concept of combining expert predictions typically and nearly always better than individual expert predictions. So there's that fundamental theory that if we can combine a lot of predictions together, we're likely to get much more accurate predictions. And we are trying to currently apply that theory to this consensus model. So we're combining expert predictions of mineral deposit locations to improve our targeting. The crowd is fairly unique in creating the conditions to do this because you are getting lots of different people that are working independently. So they're not biasing each other in their approach. And it does mean that you can combine lots of different approaches at the same time because everybody's working together at the same time. So it's a fairly unique way of allowing this to happen. It would be quite difficult to do that in the same way, for example, if you were to pay a group of individuals to kind of go and do that at the same time. So that's kind of that overview of that whole piece on the consensus and the exploration targeting. And then we kind of went through a couple of discrete examples of geological processes and tasks that we do, which we can potentially automate using data science. And that helps us generally be faster and more efficient and help get more value for our dollars. So a lot of those examples are suitable for something you could do with the crowd, but also a lot of those you could also do with a number of suppliers in the market that are also doing a lot of data science. So the key for the crowd is if you don't know which approach is best, or if you don't have any internal capability to test that, the crowd can give you some quick feedback on which model might work best for you. So it gives you that sense of benchmarking, which often is quite hard to get in that machine learning space. And finally, it's a good time to get stuck into doing these kind of data-driven approaches and learning if you can't get into the field. So I think it's a good opportunity to get started. So, yep, that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Holly. That was a fantastic talk. Thanks very much for your thoughts there. I'll just, while people are getting their questions down, I'll start one off, and hopefully people can get a few more questions there. You mentioned about trying to get around people's biases by using the crowd. Is there a risk that it becomes a bit circular because you've got the experts chose the area and hence the data collection was biased by where we were looking. So our data sets are only decent in a few spots and pretty ordinary elsewhere. So do we sort of get into a little bit of a circular argument there?
I think you can do it, particularly if you take a strongly machine learning approach. What I like about the consensus model is that it allows, for areas where you have less data, but you might be taking a purely kind of structural interpretation, assuming there is some form of data in these low data density areas, you are enabling people to bring in a model which is based on less data. I think absolutely we see, and we had to work through this with the Explorer Challenge as well, when you're doing very data-driven approaches like machine learning, they really are going to naturally favor areas with more density of data. So we encourage people to kind of deal with that in a number of different ways. People often synthesize data to help get around that or simulate some data. But yeah, it's a risk, and certainly I think we need to see how we can encourage people to still build models in areas of less data density.
Okay, thank you. Question from Stuart Masters. Why did many points have a mean distance score of around 0.56 in the slide showing scatter plot of mean distance score versus
yes,
mean commodity score?
Good question. I'm going to have to see if I can remember this. So caveat, obviously you probably can tell I'm not a data scientist. I'm pretty sure this was some of the random guess models that we tried to generate. So we kind of created a number of models ourselves to work out what are different variations of random guessing. So I gave that example of, if we put a gold deposit in the middle of every single one of those squares, what would you get? And we did kind of a number similar to that. So I'm pretty sure that is what is kind of creating that line there, or that some of the people submitting were doing kind of similar things and trying to say like, oh, if I just put everything as copper or everything as gold, what will it look like? So people do those kind of iterations as well. But good question. Sorry, I can't answer it as well as I would like.
All right, thank you. Question from Andy. I'm not sure who Andy is. Re the Gold Corp Red Lake crowdsourcing predictions. What information is available regarding accuracy of predictions? Gold Corp has stated that 10,000 times prize money in gold was the result. Is there any specific data?
No, not as far as I know, but good question. So I think this is kind of what I was alluding to before, is that it's really difficult to actually say what is the accuracy of these predictions, right? I mean, I think out of the Gold Corp challenge, you're getting hundreds of targets, so it's never going to be feasible to test all of those. I think what was interesting that came out of that is that the Gold Corp geologists did say, 50% of the targets that came out of that they had already identified and 50% not. So I guess that's kind of a good thing, that's kind of reinforcing what they already know as well as additional. But I agree, Gold Corp have made some really big claims that they went from $100 million company to $1 billion company based on specifically that competition. But it is really difficult to get that data out. I think what's interesting though, and I forgot to mention this while I was talking, is that the current competition we're running with the South Australian government, all of the results will be public. So we're kind of running the same process, but all of these targets, including the consensus map, is going to be available to everybody. So whilst we're not going to be able to so clearly show exactly what the outcomes are, the original data itself will be available to everybody to look through. And we hope to be able to at least kind of report back in some ways almost through public ASX releases of companies that are then looking at those targets and doing work, how some of those results are used. So sorry, I've kind of taken that down a bit of a different angle, but yeah, ultimately it's difficult to get feedback on all of those predictions. I think speaking to some of the geologists that were there may be slightly exaggerated, but I wouldn't want to say that myself. I would say though, it is a difficult thing across the board if you look at companies like Gold Spot, for example, it's very difficult for them. They're probably seen as one of the leaders in using machine learning in exploration targeting. But again, it's difficult for even them to really be able to have these case studies that clearly say this amount of the predictions are correct.
Okay, just to expand on the South Australian challenge, how much of that data was already available, or was it a whole bunch of data that they got together specifically for this?
No, it was all already available. Mostly, there's a few things kind of added in, but I think a huge part of these challenges, which is kind of not the role that I particularly feel, but is engaging the community. So all that data was already there, but it wasn't necessarily being used by lots of different people in this particular sense, to generate targets. So it's really about what questions do you ask and how do you incentivize people to answer them with those data sets. So they were already all existing, but I think there hasn't been a time when you've had this many people working on them together at the same time, and then enabling all those results to then be publicly available. So hopefully it should be a pretty good data source for all the explorers out there to use.
Okay, well, yeah, I guess it goes back to being asking the right questions, doesn't it? Just what exploration is all about.
Yeah, and I think in that case, so some of the things we're asking people to do in that ExploreSA challenge, we have asked people to, for example, say, who can you predict deposits or areas of interest in some of the areas that are underexplored? So, particularly in the Gawler, there's a huge focus around the Olympic belt and around Olympic Dam and Prominent Hill Carrapateena. But the department are convinced that there's prospectivity for lots of other deposit styles, as are many explorers. So they're trying to incentivize people to put forward targets in some of those underexplored areas. And interestingly, I'm sure there's probably some people on the call with tenements South Australia, but there's actually a lot of land available in the Gawler still. So I know a lot of it is undercover, but a lot of it is not that deep cover. So there's lots of potential there to use some of this information to really help with some of the exploration projects over there.
Okay, thank you. We've got one more question here, and just as I'm reading that out, please, if anyone else has a question, either type it quickly on the Q&A or use the raise hand function on the next to your name, and I'll see if I can unmute you for the question. But this question is from Russell Mears. How many ore bodies have been found in greenfield situation using these methods?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I guess we'll see after the South Australian one. I think, with Goldcorp, that was near mine. Integra was very near mine. And that was, I'm sure probably a number of people on the call actually took part in that one. But that was really around processing all their near mine data. Obviously, Oz was kind of greenfields, kind of brownfields, area that they have been working in, and we don't have the results from that yet. So I think it's a little bit hard to say. I think if you were to look closely at, if you're interested, for example, to say, instead of this consensus approach, what about something like machine learning? And there's quite a few companies on the market, like Goldspot, like Orfox, like Earth AI, that you could go and have a look at and see some of their case studies. As far as I know, this kind of consensus approach has not really been used widely, so there's not likely to be too many positive indicators yet. But I think the South Australian one will be really interesting because it's publicly open data, so we'll really be able to see what people do with it. So hopefully be able to, in a year's time, give you a lot more of a better answer to that question.
Fantastic. Thanks, Holly. I don't see
there's
any...
one more from Stuart. How do you ensure best experts to contribute?
Oh, there you go. It's popped up at the top.
That's a good question, Stuart. And we actually, we can't. So I think this comes back to that kind of concept of when you get a lot of experts to combine together to give their predictions, you're not necessarily after the best one. And I think that's kind of this concept that because we're working in such chaotic environments, there's no one best model. So I think we're all brought into that. A lot of the time we won't get the best experts across the world contributing. We'll get some of them, but we're not going to get all the best consultants. It's more that we're getting enough experts contributing across the board, that when we do create this kind of consensus output, it's meaningful because it has enough data going into it. So I think it's almost more of how do you ensure you get enough experts participating rather than making sure that you get the best ones. But it's a really important question to ask, and something that, you know, I think is, as we do more of these, we'll be able to have a better answer for as well.
Do you find then that you get a lot of people who have no idea about exploration or mining getting involved in this and think it's just an exercise in number crunching?
Maybe to start with, but certainly we help those people team up with geologists. So if you look at the Explorer Challenge, all of the successful teams were a combination. We certainly try and encourage data scientists to come and get involved because we think their skill sets are really relevant to this approach. There's lots of you know, applications for machine learning, but you really need domain knowledge as well. So we try and help people kind of form teams so they can approach this with always with a domain expert in their team. And yeah, certainly for the Explorer Challenge, that was what kind of a definition of success, really. All of the top teams were a combination.
Excellent. All right, thanks very much for that. I think we've, I know we've got another one from Stuart there as well. How does the success of consensus approach compare to using single experts, e.g. using the outliers, the geo who thinks very differently to the others?
Oh, yeah, good question. Like, I don't know, I suppose if we look at exploration broadly, we kind of know what our discovery rates are, but it would be hard to say if when the things attributed to individual geos or a team of geos. I think, yeah, it's difficult to say. It's a theory that we're trying to test, but I think ultimately the theory should hold if we are able to get multiple different approaches and combine them together. But you're always going to, I think you're overall that should improve discovery rates overall. But I think you're always going to have those outliers or those kind of genius outliers that just come up with something that's completely out of the box. But I think as an overall, will this approach improve predictions overall? I think yes, but you're always going to have those outliers.
Thank you. Just as a closing question, because we're almost at time anyway, what challenge or what problem in exploration mining do you think this approach will work best for?
Well, I think, to be honest, like this consensus approach is really relevant to predicting deposits, but really on that kind of local to regional scale. I certainly think that with the complex and chaotic nature of mineral deposits, we still very much need to have something that can do direct detection when we get down to a deposit scale. I don't think we're going to be able to use these competitions to really pinpoint a really strong X marks the spot. It's going to help you zone in, but I don't think, yeah, it's necessarily going to give you that definitive X marks the spot. So I think, but for exploration targeting generally, consensus is a really, really good application of improving that. I think across the board, in terms of crowd and data science, really, there are a lot of different problems that suit it, but it's mostly things that would be problems that you're just not quite sure how to solve. Some of the areas that I'm particularly interested in, which I really want to see things come out, is around a lot of this public spectral data that's now available. I think a lot of us have used a lot of tools like the spectral geologist, but there's lots of when you look at spectral data, there's so many data points that it suits machine learning so well. You've got maybe like 3,000 columns per row of data, right? So there's so much information in there, and that suits machine learning approaches really well. So I think people are having success there, and the near miss stuff also is good application. So lots of exciting things happening. I could go on for ages about that, so you probably just stop talking. But yeah, I think this consensus piece around targeting is really, really interesting. I hope we can see some more results on that as well in the near future.
Excellent. Thanks very much for your time, Holly. It's been a pleasure to have you on our webinar, and I hope all our guests enjoy the evening. Thanks very much. Look forward to our YouTube channel to see a copy of this if you haven't seen it before, if you missed part of it or want to hear it all again. But in the meantime, thanks very much, and we'll see you for the next webinar. Thanks, Holly.
Thanks, Peter. Cheers. Bye, everyone.